Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. I'm very pleased to welcome Walter Hixson to the program today. Dr. Hixson is Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Akron, where he specializes in diplomatic and cultural history. Dr. Hixson is the author of a number of books, including The Myth of American Diplomacy, National Identity in U.S. Foreign Policy, and American Settler Colonialism, A History. His new book, Israel's Armor, The Israel Lobby and the First Generation of the Palestine Conflict, is due out soon. His PhD is from the University of Colorado at Boulder in 1986. And now here's my interview with Dr. Hixson. I think one of the reasons that I was very eager to talk to you is that the Israel lobby has been in the news quite a bit recently because of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's tweets and the resulting furor over it. And she suggested that the Israel lobby is powerful because of the money it funnels into political campaigns. Would you say that she's right about that, or are there other forces that account for the lobby's power in Washington?
Well, I just published something on that on Juan Cole's site, Informed Comment, and I called it an absurdity that she was attacked because everyone in Congress knows that the economic clout of the Israel lobby plays a role. Tweeting is not the ideal framework for good communication, and hers was as a tweet, it wasn't very effective. But the basic idea that the Israel lobby and its financing play a role in American politics is beyond dispute.
Well, she also recently engaged in a dialogue with Elliott Abrams, who is coming back into government as our representative to Venezuela. And I think she seems to have violated another one of the sacrosanct Washington rules, in that she actually challenged him on his policies that he has been involved in Latin America. We haven't seen a lot of that from the Congress, have we?
No, it's refreshing. There are a couple of new members who are angry enough and assertive enough to break some rules, and as you say, not real rules, but it's a good thing, and there's not enough of them, and certainly when it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue, it's been a Congress that has been very complacent and very compliant, and has enabled really pretty significant violations of human rights and of international law. And we can and must do more, and members of some of the new members of Congress can make a difference.
Well, I certainly hope so. Well, your upcoming book, Israel's Armor, The Israel Lobby and the First Generation of the Palestine Conflict, according to the publisher, examines the origins and early history of the Israel lobby, looking at its influence on American foreign policy. I think this is a subject of which many Americans don't know nearly enough about. Can you maybe tell us some of the crucial events that demonstrated the power of the lobby before and during the creation of the State of Israel?
Sure. I could talk quite a bit about that, so feel free to cut me off. But
Okay.
There's a book by a couple of political scientists, very prominent political scientists. You've probably heard of the book by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, called The Israel Lobby, and was brutally attacked, even though previously these men had been nothing but praised and very heavily published, and were from the universities of Chicago and Harvard, respectively. But the lobby really weighed in. In any case, that book really focused on the modern period, really the 21st century, and one of its main arguments was the role of the lobby in promoting the Iraq War. So nobody had really done a solid history of the origins and evolution of the lobby. And so I view what I've done as a foundational history. And it's based on both the State Department diplomatic records as well as just a wonderful archive I found at the American Jewish Archives in New York, the papers of Isaiah Leo Kennan. and that's spelled Kenen. And he basically was the workhorse of the Israel lobby, together with the well-known Israeli diplomat Abba Eban. Those two men, more than any other two, created the Israel lobby. One of the aspects of this that's important to think about is, what is the Israel lobby and how do you define it? And I wrestled with that. It's both a structural lobby, which is AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and other formal groups. That's what I mean by structural. But it's also informal. A lot of not just American Jews and Jewish groups, although there are plenty of those, but also Protestant groups, and both modernist and fundamentalist. So the lobby is really a broad-based, small L lobby, not a capital L1 organization. Although that being said, AIPAC is extremely powerful as a large L lobbyist, and has a tremendous impact in Washington and really nationwide. So it's complicated, but it's both broad-based, structured, and informal, and was really created out of the American Zionist movement before Israel was even created. So one of the main contributions I think I make with this book is how deeply rooted the so-called Israel lobby is, and how effective it was from very early on, even before the end of World War II.
What was the first success, really, of the incipient Israel lobby in U.S. politics?
I kind of put the foundation of the lobby at the famous Biltmore Conference, which was at the Biltmore Hotel in New York City, the heart of American Jewry, in 1942. And this is when, right in the midst of the revelations of the Nazi genocide. And American Jews were, understandably, globally, Jews were understandably outraged, angry, and this fueled the Zionist movement, which had begun, as I'm sure you know, in the previous war, in the World War I era,
right,
and had grown throughout the 1930s, but it really begins to take off with the Nazi genocide. And so American Zionists, starting at Biltmore in 1942, became really crucial, because the Zionists living in Palestine were in the process of falling out with the British over British efforts to regulate them in relationship to the Palestinian local population in what was called the British Mandate of Palestine, which dated back to World War I. So as they were falling out with the British, what would become the Israelis were closing ties with the American Jewish, I hesitate to say community, because one of the things that people don't realize is that a lot of American Jews were not Zionists and did not want the religion to become associated with a Jewish state. And that's still the case, although it should be said that the lobby has been very successful in mobilizing Jewish public opinion behind the Israeli cause. But in any case, I date the lobby to the Biltmore Conference. To further answer your question, what Kennan and Eban and some others discovered is in 1944 was the first time that the lobby weighed in the presidential and other elections, other national elections. And they saw right away they had an immediate impact, that by calling and having constituents call and write to their congressmen and to pressure the Democratic and Republican Party platforms, both of which embrace Zionism, that they could be effective. So really it goes way back to the 1944 national elections.
And those were really quite crucial, because we ended up with Truman in the White House, who, against all the advice of his cabinet and the State Department, did recognize the new Israeli government.
Absolutely. Although he frequently became frustrated with what he called the political Jews, and he felt he'd done a lot for them. And of course, he would go on to make historic decisions to recognize Israel, as you say, in opposition to the advice from the State Department. And one of the things that's important to understand is that the lobby expressly saw itself as opposing the American State Department. And that's what they wanted to do, was undermine the State Department, undermine the people, in other words, who are charged with conducting, planning, making recommendations about American foreign policy. So really, they're directly counter to the diplomacy of the United States, although they certainly don't like to be categorized that way.
One of the things that we constantly hear in relation to Israel, and I know, of course, the Israel lobby has promoted this, is the idea of the special relationship that exists between the U.S. and Israel. You wrote a book a few years back on settler colonialism in America, and it struck me in beginning that book that there are a lot of similarities between ourselves and Israel. Does that explain some of the affinity that Americans have? What in our culture is drawing us into this special relationship?
Well, it's a very good point that you've gleaned, and that is that there are, it's not I think this is kind of what separates my book, in addition to going back to the foundations, from Mearsheimer and Walt and other books that are out there, other work that's out there. There's no, it's very important to understand that shared kind of cultural affinity. You use the term affinity, and I've used it as well. It's a good term that really structures the special relationship and helps it go. And so that is rooted in both having a settler colonial, aka frontier tradition. The United States also took land from quote unquote savage people who resisted in opposition to modernity and progress. And so this is how Zionists viewed themselves also. And really, race and space are what they have in common. It's removing people deemed to be inferior from the land that you believe you are chosen to take over. Of course, we had manifest destiny, and Zionists also view this, not that all were religious, because many weren't, including foundational members like Ben-Gurion and others were not particularly religious or believed in biblical literalism, although many do, and certainly many American Protestants do as well.
Right.
But settler colonialism is important. What settler colonial states, not just the United States and Israel, but Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, there are many others, Argentina, they create facts on the ground. And it's a zero-sum game. It's us or them in terms of control of the land. And we see this with the occupied territories through Israel's history. So religious affinity and kind of cultural affinity are an important part of this, not just lobbying. If there wasn't a cultural ground to build the lobby on, it wouldn't be as effective as it is.
You're listening to Wider View, a weekly conversation with analysts and activists rarely found in the mainstream media. Wider View is made available free of charge to radio stations nationwide, and a podcast of this show is available on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play Music as Wider View Radio, and at widerviewradio.podbean.com. You can also follow us on Facebook at Wider View Radio. Well, I'm going to turn the corner just a little bit and talk. I know your primary focus for many years has been diplomatic history. And we have a few things going on that I sort of want to talk to you about. Right now, we have a group within our government who have now risen to very powerful positions in our government called Neoconservatives. People like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and Elliott Abrams and others that seem almost pathologically driven to start wars. They're currently threatening Iran, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Russia, China, and probably several others that we're not aware of. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what drives these people. What do they, in this constant warmongering, why do they find such a ready audience in Washington?
Well, that's a pretty big question. I'm not sure I can give a masterful reply to that. I mean, I think it's deeply rooted, again, much like what we were just talking about, in American history maybe more so than people realize. Certainly these neoconservatives are on the right, and they're far right and reactionary, but that's again, just as the lobby is built on cultural ground, people like Trump and the neoconservatives are really built on cultural ground. They're more American probably than a lot of people would like to admit. So again, I think these centuries of Indian removal, ethnic cleansing, going way back, are deeply rooted in our culture. Many people would argue that the United States is a warfare state, despite the fact that a lot of people, promote peace and oppose wars when they don't go well, mainly, like Vietnam. The United States has rather more or less constantly engaged in warfare and aggression, settled a continent that way. So as disturbing as it may be, to some respects, this is who we are. Not that there aren't a lot of differences and that those people aren't on the right-wing fringe, and they're not empowered all of the time. But they're always out there, and as in our political culture, from time to time, they get power. Mm-hmm. And they got power under Reagan, and now these same people are back. I mean, Elliott Abrams is essentially, he should be imprisoned as a human rights war criminal. He should hardly be in a position of power. I mean, the things that Abrams helped perpetrate in El Salvador and Nicaragua and other places are really war crimes. And so it's awful that they're back in power, and it testifies both to the fact that our public isn't able to really track all this in a sophisticated way. Not enough people are, but some people are. And as you pointed out, we have some new people in Congress who are willing to take them on.
Yeah. And one of the other things that's happening, the combination of these people who could say have taken the gloves off, or who've taken off the mask of some kind of humanitarian or higher noble purpose from our foreign policy rhetoric, at least, them in combination with Donald Trump, as the president, seem to be really disturbing our relationships with other countries. And the Munich Conference, the Munich Security Conference earlier this week is a good example. The more or less abortive conference in Poland. We're finding that perhaps one of the results of this might be to diminish American hegemony in the world. You think that's a possibility?
Well, I think that's certainly happening now. A lot of that is associated with Trump. And it was very telling this week, as I'm sure you saw, when Mike Pence attempted the standard lead-in applause line for greetings from Donald Trump, and the Europeans just sat there like stones and ignored it. So, it's not hard for people who have some sense, like some of these European leaders, to realize Trump is beyond the pale. And he really is beyond the pale. He's beyond the pale of anything we've seen. He makes Ronald Reagan, who was a very conservative right-wing political figure, look extremely moderate. So Trump's reactionary populism is beyond the pale. It's quite possible it could be quickly repaired if he's defeated in 2020 and there's a standard kind of liberal president or even a moderate Republican. That doesn't look likely, but who comes into the office. I'm not sure permanent damage has been done, but on the kind of longer scale of things, you could argue that American power really peaked in 1945. A lot of people think it might have, peaked in 1991 with the Persian Gulf War and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. But in any case, the United States can't be as globally dominant as it once was, whether Trump ruins that in the shorter term or not. The long-term arc, I think, is toward more multilateral. And we need global solutions in one nation. And this nation, frankly, often just doesn't have the wisdom to lead anyway. It's not, I wouldn't give us a real high grade for our global leadership, given the problems in the world.
Right. I would have to agree with you on that score for sure. Yeah. And I think a lot of that is due to the American public, as you mentioned kind of earlier, just not really being either aware or, having the background to understand.
No, I mean, our great national myth is that the people are wise. And, it just sounds elitist to say things, to call that into doubt. But lots of the people aren't wise, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why we get ourselves into this situation. And we've really done it royally now with just, an out and out reactionary who denies climate change and all kinds of things. So it's, he legitimately won the election for whatever reason. And so we're not locked into that. But from time to time, our system and the decisions the public makes get us into trouble. We have to acknowledge that and try to, do better.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to say for us that I didn't ask? Any issues you'd like to bring up?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things I try to emphasize to people are just basic facts that seem to get lost in the shuffle with the Israel lobby. For a little country like Israel of 8.5 million people to have been the greatest recipient of U.S. foreign assistance in history, and to have the most powerful lobby ever active on American shores, much more powerful than anything like the China lobby or the Miami Cubans or anything else. So it's a small country that's received over $100 billion. Here you had Benjamin Netanyahu treating the president of the United States, Barack Obama, with absolute contempt. Mm-hmm. And Obama responds with a 10-year, $38 billion assistance agreement. That's how powerful the lobby is. And it's really lopsided for a tiny little country like Israel to dominate. It's really a tail wagging the dog type situation. And we ought to address it, not just because of a lot of money going to a small country. If they needed it or if it were good for the United States, you could make a case for it. But I don't think it's been good for the United States, and they don't need it. They've won every war and can defend themselves quite nicely without another dollar of American assistance. But they get it because of the lobby. So I think those things are really important to understand, and I don't think a lot of people understand.
I hope through your book and your efforts, a few more people will. That would be great.
Let's hope so.
Good. And thank you very much for speaking with me, Dr. Hixson. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. Take care.
In my conversation with Dr. Hixson, I brought up the recent Munich Security Conference where Vice President Pence made a fool of himself by berating the Europeans for their failure to violate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known here as the Iran nuclear deal. It is enlightening, however, to hear the voice of a true diplomat address that same gathering. Here are some excerpts from the address of Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif.
This past Monday, millions of Iranians gathered for mass rallies to mark the 40th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, an earthquake that collapsed a pillar of U.S. dominance in West Asia. We've never been forgiven by the United States for having exercised our right to self-determination. As a result, we have long been the target of an unhealthy fixation, let's say an obsession, which continues to this very day. The demonization of my country has been a convenient cross for 7 consecutive American presidents to bear. Even a more convenient smokescreen for America's regional clients to hide behind. It is long overdue for the United States to dismantle this malign institution, for it has today morphed into one of the greatest threats, even to America's own security and interest, let alone peace and security in the rest of the world and the region. In the past 2 years, the US has taken its animus towards Iran to a new extreme, as epitomized by its unlawful and unilateral abrogation of its commitments under the painstakingly negotiated Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was unanimously endorsed by a Security Council resolution a Security Council of which the United States is a permanent member. To gain, in fact, accomplices in its lawlessness, the US is now laboring to force others to violate that very resolution, which explicitly calls for normalization of economic relations with Iran. Yesterday, right here in Munich, Mr. Pence repeated this farce when he arrogantly demanded that Europe must join the United States in undermining its own security and breaking its obligations. This malign obsession with Iran is imposing costs on others, and especially in our region, which has for 40 years suffered from the consequences of insistence of the United States on making wrong choices. Driven by its pathological obsession with Iran, America has long encouraged recklessness and destructive adventurism on the parts of its clients. Let me remind you a bit of history. From arming Saddam Hussein in his attack against Iran, including the use of chemical weapons, to supporting the propagation of extremism. Just listen to what Crown Prince MBS has said. From aiding and abetting the ruining of Syria and bombing the innocent in Yemen, to whitewashing the incarceration of a prime minister and the dismemberment of a journalist. In parallel, the US has systematically shielded Israel's constant aggression against the Palestinian people, while insulating its severe violations of the sovereignty of Lebanon and Syria. And all in the name of containing Iran. In spite of all the ignorant hate speech by American officials, let me remind you that we Iranians are proud to be inheritors of a great civilization. The entirety of humanity, from our perspective, is today riding in the same boat. And we will either sail together or sink together. Our renowned poet Sa'di testified to this truth 900 years ago when he said, "All human beings are members of one frame, since all at first from the same essence came. When time afflicts one limb with pain, the other limbs cannot at rest remain." Thank you for your attention.
That's our show for this week. If you have comments or questions about what you've heard, email me at widerviewradio@gmail.com or comment on our Facebook page at Wider View Radio. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.